Welcome to the Computer History Museum, Eric Dunn. We're delighted to have you here. Today is July 24th, 2019, and I'm Marguerite Gong Hancock from the Exponential Center. We're thrilled to add your story and record to our collection, so thank you for being with us.
Happy to be here.
So I'd like to begin at the beginning, since this is oral history, and ask about your early life, your family, or other influences that kind of shaped who you are.
Sure. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, though I grew up mostly in New Jersey and California. My father was a physician, though he never practiced. He was a research scientist. He did epidemiology, focusing in tropical medicine, and later got a degree in anthropology. So because of his work, we moved first to Mill Valley, California, where he worked at the University of California. And then later, we had 2 stints abroad in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where I went to school for kindergarten and 5th grade. My parents were divorced in 1968, so we returned to my mother's hometown, Princeton, New Jersey. And so many of my growing up years were in Princeton, New Jersey, from 1968 until I went to boarding school in 1973. But we had stints in California, Kuala Lumpur, and actually the UK, 6 months in the UK, and in Princeton while I was growing up. So I would say the early childhood memory is almost never being in the same school twice in a row and feeling a little bit, insecure because of that. And then things settled down, by the time I was an early teenager.
Did you have any particular passions or interests that started at that young age that have carried through, or has it been an evolution?
I would say I was, sort of, mechanically inclined. I like electrical toys and, toy steam engines and stuff like that, typical kind of engineering-oriented things. My father was a scientist, and his father also had been a physician. So, there was kind of a science streak in the family. I think I always expected to have some kind of technical, what we would today call STEM element in my life, and that was accurate.
So you went to Princeton Day School in New Jersey, is that right? And then went to Phillips Exeter?
Yeah, I was in Princeton Day School. Actually, there were 2 stints. We were the first class of 3rd graders in 1965 when the school first opened. Then came back in 6th grade, stayed there through 10th grade, went to Exeter, where my father had actually gone to school as well, for my 11th and 12th grade years. Really kind of a coincidence. Some of my Princeton Day School friends decided to go to Exeter, and I kind of followed them there. I would say Exeter was really a centerpiece of my education. I think I'd been a good student at Princeton Day School, and I got a little bit of a comeuppance at Exeter, which was, then, now, and I think still is quite academically rigorous. So I had a little bit of a reset, had to work harder, and that was good for me. And so that was probably, it was a sort of it's kind of a coincidence that I went there, but I think in hindsight it was quite healthy for me.
Any particular teacher or experience that you think, wow, this was really kind of a galvanizing moment for you?
I had the English teacher when I first arrived, Mr. Proulx, who kind of explained to me that I was actually not very good at writing, and he gave me, I think I got like a D plus C minus on paper, which is, by far the worst grade I'd ever gotten. And that was kind of my call to action when I realized, boy, I'm not going to be able to cruise. I'm going to have to work a little bit harder. So that was memorable. Then I had a series, very good math teachers. So I think I'd done calculus at Princeton Day School in 10th grade, and so there were 2 years of post-calculus math at Exeter, and so I think I was lucky to have a school that could kind of keep providing challenging material. So differential equations, real analysis, those are the ones I remember, and that was pretty heady stuff for a 17-year-old.
Absolutely, very early for you to be doing that. Do you? In terms of kind of hands-on experiences with technology as it was evolving, do you remember kind of first
experience? Computers obviously have been a huge part of my life, including central to the, essential to the Intuit story. We had a PDP-8 computer at Princeton Day School that you could program in BASIC or in the assembly language. I don't think I really did much in assembly language. So teletype, paper tape, very primitive by today's standard, but it was sort of a hands-on device that you could hit stop on the console and single step through instructions and hardware. So that was I don't think I wasn't kind of I wasn't hardcore. There were people who spent 10 hours or 12 or 20 hours a week with the school computer. This is in 1972, 1973. I was kind of more on the periphery, but I'd gotten interested. Exeter didn't really teach me much. I didn't really pay much attention to computers. They had an HP that did basic program. You could run BASIC on it, but that wasn't interesting. So I didn't really pick up my interest in computer science until later when I was in college.
Great. Well, let's take you then. When you were looking at the array of options, how did you decide where you ended up at Harvard?
So, such a simpler time. I wouldn't quite say you signed up for Harvard, but it was almost like that. So, and my father had gone to Harvard, and I went to Exeter, and out of my graduating class of 250 people, or maybe 275, 40 of us went to Harvard. So, it was. I think we had a theory that Harvard had gotten kind of tired of student radicals in the late 60s and early 70s disrupting life, and they said, let's get a bunch of nerdy preppies for a few years and kind of get back on the straight and level. And I don't know whether that was fact or fiction, but there's probably some dynamic like that would was helpful to me. So it was quite a straightforward process in those days. And of course, I was a strong student. I graduated 5th in my class at Exeter. So I after my early comeuppance, I was a successful student there, and that obviously helped me get into college.
You mentioned the tumultuous time that was happening culturally and socially. Was that a part of influence for you, or were you more focused on your studies?
I would say I was more aware. Exeter was a small town. When I was at Princeton Day School, of course, we shared a town with Princeton University, and so in the 70s, when I was in high school, there were student protests, and there was something called the Institute for Defense Analysis, which did government-sponsored research, and students got worked up about that. And so that was kind of on the periphery of my consciousness. I didn't go to any events myself, but we did have we had a sit-in day at Princeton Day School when the Laos or Cambodian invasion occurred during the Vietnam War, and that was deeply upsetting to people who were already opposed to the war in Vietnam. And so there's sort of a mini student strike, and sympathetic teachers, and we spent half a day sitting in circles in the halls rather than in the classroom, and then life went back to normal. So it was on the periphery of my consciousness. By the time I got to Harvard in 1975, there's a strong kind of collective recollection of student activism, but it had faded away, I'd say, and people are kind of getting down to business a little bit more.
So you started, I understand, as a physics major.
Yeah, I studied physics, and I graduated summa cum laude, thank you, in physics from Harvard after 4 years. And so go ahead.
I was just going to say, with that focus, and then you mentioned that this is really the time that your focus on programming became central to you.
How did that happen? I would say I had a couple of summer jobs where I did Fortran programming, and Fortran programming was kind of the, was sort of the technology of choice for scientists and economists in the 70s when I was in college. And so it's a kind of clumsy old compiled language, but I picked it up pretty readily, and I was fairly good at that. I think during my senior year I had a part-time job for an environmental consulting firm called Urco, Fresh Pond Parkway, and basically doing Fortran programming for them. So I something I found that I could do, and then probably the real spark to my interest came when I took a course at Harvard called Applied Math 110, which was a very rigorous computer science course, focusing on assembly language programming for the P2P11 computer. But we taught us, what were then other modern languages, a little bit of C, Lisp, Forth, I don't know, some oddities like that. But mainly, you just spent a lot of time coding, and so that was deeply engaging. So I did the physics curriculum, but I'd have to say I could tell by a year or two in that this is not my life voyage. As being an academic scientist, and so it's kind of welcome to find something that I was a lot more excited about. In the spring of my senior year, I did an independent study just to have a way to continue to work on computer programming projects. And I had a friend who had the idea for building a digital music synthesizer, which is a device today that is a small piece of software on your Apple Watch or something, but at that time was a mini refrigerator-sized hardware box, laboriously put together with soldering iron and wire wrap tools. And so he kind of did he had a friend to do the hardware design. We did a couple of components of the software, and so at great effort and no commercial value, built a device where you could type in on a keyboard a musical score using kind of a ASCII notation, and then it would play a Bach two-part partita or something like that in kind of a mechanical way. But it was very
early.
That was interesting, and it was early. That was 1978, 1979, and within a year or two, that was available very readily on an Apple computer. But I mean, there was like a 6-month period when we might have been state of the art, I would say. But anyway, that was fun for me. That was kind of very, very interesting. And so by the time I was a senior, I kind of knew this is what was fun for me to do.
As you think about your approach to that early project or others, what do you see things that were defining for you later as you started to evolve, or was because you said this was...
Are you talking about my just in coding or kind of my life, or I mean, what
both,
do you...
Both in coding and the decision, and you said this was going to be a core part of your journey.
I think one thing that stayed with me for a long time was kind of this concept in coding of getting something in my head, where I would sort of think about it to the point where I couldn't see all the details, but I knew how this should work. And you could ask me any question, and after a moment's thought, I could say, here's what this component will do. And that, so I would say for anything complicated, that was kind of my coding approach, is to think about it for a while. And I could be like driving the car, or running, or just sitting in an airplane, without even any paper in front of me, and I would just kind of visualize the problem and think it through, and then I'd sort of assemble it in my head, and then it wasn't quite a matter of just writing the characters down, but I'd have the outline. I think that went back to writing a basic interpreter in Macro 11 assembly language, or the work I did on the music synthesizer. This concept of kind of getting it in my head.
That's so interesting to see how your approach. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Anything else during your time as an undergraduate that you would like to talk about?
Yeah, I was a nerd. I worked hard. I did well, but I worked hard. And I would say the story that I remember with sort of mixed feeling is in February of 1978. Probably all my roommates said, "We're going to Mardi Gras. We're borrowing Steven's station wagon, and 5 of us are driving down. You should come with us." And I thought, that would be cool. And I said, nope, I got a physics 164 problem set to do. So I stayed in Cambridge, in a cold long winter weekend doing my problem set for physics 164. And they all, had a wonderful time, driving to Mardi Gras and back. And, both were good things. And, my friend whose car it was went on to get a PhD in in math and works at the Rockefeller Institute, so works for NIH actually, is a distinguished researcher. And it wasn't like it ruined his life, to goof off for one weekend. But that was an example of the kind of choices that I made. Yep.
You had your first job out of college and went to IBM
Yeah.
as an engineer.
Yeah, I would say going to IBM in 1979 was a little bit like going to maybe Oracle or Microsoft today, kind of halfway between. And a little unusual for a graduating physics student. All of my other classmates in the physics department went on to academic programs. I'd actually planned to go to a master's program at Cambridge University in computer science, which would have made a lot of sense. And I applied, and of course you did it by airmail and so on. And I got a letter back saying, we don't have the letter of recommendation from your teaching assistant in AM110, and or your teaching fellow, who would have given me a great recommendation. So I said, you can email, you had to knock on his door, find him, can you send a letter? He said, oh yeah, I'll do it. And so I thought, okay, taken care of. And then 2 weeks later, I got another airmail letter back from Cambridge saying, we don't have this letter. And I went back and talked to him. Oh yeah, I'll do it. And then 6 weeks later, sorry, too much time has elapsed. You can't do it. So just by total happenstance, I didn't, and very frustrating and so easily solved today. But at that time, logistics and paperwork were important. So just by total coincidence, I didn't enter onto an academic career in computer science, which I think is probably where I would have gone. I applied to Yale Law School. I think I got in off the waiting list in the spring of my year. So that was what my friends were doing. I could have gone to law school. I had a couple of job offers from oil companies based on some of the work I'd actually done in the consulting firm. And then, IBM was kind of mainstream and was in computer science, and it was something I was interested in. So I chose that. But I would say it was kind of a unadventurous choice for anyone in 1979. And it was an interesting job for me at IBM. The programming language was APL, which was a sophisticated interpreted language with a funky character set. It was like writing hieroglyphics, and so it was an oddity and didn't lead anywhere, but it was kind of fun. It was an interesting job, but I didn't really love being in a large company. It was good to be exposed to a large company early on and understand what was good and what was bad about it. But I applied to business school after 2 years there, in a sense, because I think I used the expression, I wanted to throw my cards in the air. I didn't kind of love the trajectory I was on, and I wanted to do something different.
So talk about business school and
Yeah.
your time there at HBS.
Yeah, I think I owe HBS a debt of gratitude, because even though it was an academic institution on the East Coast, somehow it exposed me to the idea that something cool was happening in Silicon Valley. So I had a section mate, Vivek Ranadive, who started TIBCO, who had spent the year, before he came to business school, working at one of the earliest companies that was using the brand new low-cost disk drives to put together a Unix-based workstation for $10,000 when everything else was $50,000 to $100,000, and that was just in the era of an Apple computer. A hard disk-based Unix computer for $10,000 was like a Tesla Model S in 2012. It was just this is clearly the future, and so there's some sense, wow, something cool is happening in Silicon Valley. And then we had a couple of professors who I think were probably subtly trying to encourage students to think about technology career. The one who was most memorable for me is a man named Michael Spence, who I think later ended up at Stanford, who taught a course called something like Starting New Ventures, which was Harvard case studies on small companies and dealing with partners, getting funding, getting acquired, just all the kind of blocking and tackling as well as the excitement, I would say, even came through these dry case studies of operating a small business. So I would say that the seed was planted in my mind that there was a more interesting life than at IBM through kind of some of these inklings from Silicon Valley, and also this course. Yeah, I had another classmate who worked for a daisy wheel printer company, and so a daisy wheel printer was was fancy technology in 1979, 1981 actually, when I was at business school. So despite those leanings, I did a pretty mainstream thing at Harvard Business School. I took a summer internship at Bain Company, and then I signed on full time at Bain Company as a consultant. And it could easily have happened that I would have just gone into a consulting career maybe for a long time at Bain. But another thing that happened while I was at business school was I got back together with my current wife, who had been a classmate of mine, my current and only wife, Susan, who was a classmate of mine at Harvard College, and she was doing a graduate degree when I was in business school, and so we got engaged and got married actually on the day I should have gone to my HBS graduation, and she had decided to go to Stanford Law School, and so she said, "Guess what? We're moving to California this fall." And I said, "Okay, but let me check with Bain," and then with a certain amount of moaning and groaning, they agreed to put me in their then Menlo Park-based office. It was their Bay Area office in 1983. So after taking the summer off, that's how the two of us landed in Silicon Valley, October 1983. Honestly, a great time to show up with kind of an interest and aptitude for kind of computers, and early in life and flexible and able to take risks. So there's very fortuitous set of circumstances that kind of delivered me there.
So there you threw up the cards, as you said. You reinvented in several ways and had this weaving together your technical interest and the beginnings of entrepreneurship that led you to the Valley.
Yeah.
When you arrived that year, that fall,
what was here?
What were you most interested in? Right, this was this incredible kind of golden age that was just beginning in the 80s.
So I had purchased and put together a Heathkit computer. Which was basically a PDP-11 computer on a chip, an LSI-11, that was, I would say in 1980 it was state of the art. By 81 it was, it was starting to be overtaken. The IBM PC was coming out, but it was certainly when I was in business school, I was probably one of two people, 2 to 3 people in the whole class of 83 who had their own personal computer. And so I could actually word process, and I had a daisy wheel printer, and do our senior project, our second year project on the computer rather than actually having to manually type it. So I'm a little bit lost the thread here. Can you re-ask your question?
Sure.
Yep.
So I was asking when you arrived.
Yeah.
What
was the scene, right?
What was the scene in the Valley, and what was most appealing? Who were you talking with? What projects were you interested in?
So. What was going on in the Valley and what I did. So what was going on in the Valley was, the IBM PC had arrived, and so the personal computer revolution was just starting. At the same time, Sun Microsystem, I think they were up on San Antonio Road, and they were kind of bursting into the scene as a hot company with a low-cost, Unix workstation, sort of an evolutionary successor to the one the Vex company had worked on earlier. HP was important. Apple was a very successful company, and there were a handful of software companies around. Software publishing actually, I think, was just getting started at that time. Let me actually go back and, if you don't mind, tell my favorite story about Harvard Business School and
please, we can't miss that.
The software business. So, one of the things Harvard did, which I'm sure all business schools do, is bring executives and entrepreneurs from various industries into the school to talk to students. And at that time, the personal computer industry was just getting going, and they invited the founder of one of the most successful computer companies, personal computer software companies at the time, Dan Filstra, who co-created VisiCalc with Dan Bricklin, to speak to an audience of Harvard Business School students. And by this time, I think VisiCalc had skyrocketed from 0 to maybe 10 or 15 million dollars in revenue, and they were the best known brand in personal computer software at that time, probably the fall of '82 or early '83. And Dan looked at this audience of Harvard Business School students and said, I feel sorry for you guys. When I got into the business, it was still an open playing field, and a company like mine could get started. But these days, if I were you, I just wouldn't go into this business. It's the big players like us with $1 million advertising budgets who are going to, dominate this field. And so, a year ago probably would have been a great time to get into the computer software business. But now, I'm sorry, I just have to tell you, it's too late. The field is solidified. And I don't think I knew at that time, but Mike Spence was, a beta tester for Lotus 123, which was going to completely obliterate VisiCalc within the next 12 months. And so I don't know whether Dan Filstra truly believed that, or whether he was just trying to, keep the ambitious Harvard Business School students on the East Coast where he was safer to have them. So didn't work on me. But
I was like, you clearly didn't believe him.
No, I don't think I believed him. And particularly, later when it became, obvious that other companies, were getting established and had shown good success. That quick, I would say within a year, that was sort of a meme rather than kind of a point that I took seriously. So the personal computer industry was kind of coming together as I moved to Silicon Valley. The IBM PC was out. PC Magazine was hundreds of pages thick, and there's a lot of energy and excitement about what could be done with microprocessors and personal computing devices. So it was a fun time.
So we're incredibly dynamic days, and you were interacting with people who would then go on and build other companies too. Do you want to talk about some
so
other
let me tell you,
started?
leading into the Intuit story,
Yes.
so how I met Scott, who is also a Bain alumni. We actually never worked together at Bain at the same time. He had left to start Intuit by the time I joined Bain in the fall of 1983. But we had some acquaintances in common, including I think Dick Boyce probably is the person who introduced me to Scott. So if I could do a slight digression, at Bain I worked for a number of clients, but the most interesting by far was a company called Western Digital that made first actually calculator chips, and then floppy disk controller chips, and then hard disk controller chips, and then hard disk controllers, and then later went on to become actually one of, I think, the two surviving companies that makes storage, including solid state storage today. So actually a remarkably successful company, and you wouldn't necessarily have picked them out of the pack in 1983. But they were my tech client based in Orange County. And when I went there, I felt like the world was interesting. They're probably 50 million. They're public, I think, in those days, when went public early. They talked a mile a minute. There was a product plan where they doubled the storage capacity of the drives every 9 months, and complex distribution channels, and strategy discussions about chips versus board versus storage. And it was just exciting. You kind of felt like, and their customers were IBM and Compaq and Apple and Digital Equipment, and so you kind of felt like you were kind of plugged into the world of technology when you were in their building on McCabe Way in Orange County. So I got exposed to that and thought, this is fun. Working for a hospital in Central Valley, that is not so fun. Working for AC Nielsen, not so fun either. And so that was, I would say, another component. Meanwhile, I'd bought an IBM PC. I had taught myself the C programming language, and I was entertaining myself, nights and weekends by coding in C.
What kinds of projects were you doing for fun?
I wrote a calendar program. So, I think, this is sort of the or prototype for something like, you might say Microsoft Outlook, or you might just say the calendar program on your phone. But it was an electronic calendar at a time when people did not have electronic calendars. And I hired a graduate student friend of mine from Harvard who was at Berkeley to write technology to do was called Terminate and Stay Resident, where you could have two programs running at the same time, which was unusual in those days, and you could hotkey to the other program, and that was the unique feature, that you could be running a Lotus spreadsheet, hit a hotkey, and then the calendar was in front of you, and then it would go back. So I paid $1,000 to my friends to do that coding, which he thought was kind of fun. And so that would have been great. And then Borland came out with a product called Sidekick, which did kind of the same thing and more in a similar way. And they had $1 million advertising budget and deal with prize. And so I kind of said, well, it was a good product, but there wasn't necessarily a company. But I still kind of, I had 3 or 4 customers, guys I met in an airplane, paid me $79 for a copy. So I had kind of the germ of an idea of a software company, and then based on that.
What year was that?
That would have been 85 maybe. I was 84, probably 85 mostly. Dick Boyce, who was my manager at Bain, said I should introduce you to this guy, Scott Cook, who's doing a software company. I bet you guys would get along. And so I think the place I actually met him was there was a Woodside Patrol cookout or something, and my wife owns horses and things, so that was fun for her to go to. So I got there, and Dick Boyce was there, and I said, I'd like to meet Scott. And so he kind of said, okay, let me grab you. And he pulled me over and said, here he is. And I said, wait, that's Scott McNeely. I don't want to meet him. And of course, Scott McNeely was running a $100 million rocket ship company that was probably the hottest technology startup in Silicon Valley. And at that time, I think Scott would tell you, Intuit was kind of a low ebb. but that was the Scott I wanted to meet because he was doing personal computer software. And I said, here's a floppy disk with my calendar program. Tell me what you think. He wrote me a nice note and said, yeah, this is a good piece of software, but we're in the personal finance software business, so that doesn't really apply to us. And then he said, but would you like to be a beta tester or something like that? And so just by degrees, I got to know the company, which at that time was very small. It was, I think before I joined, it reached a peak of maybe 7 employees. When I joined, they had 4. I mean, it was a tiny company, and having a difficult time, I would say. But I think Scott saw that I was really interested in computer software, and I had a somewhat similar background to his, having been at Bain, and so he introduced me to his co-founder Tom, and I said, I could do some part-time projects for you. So they, kind of moonlighting. So I wrote a utility to clean up Quicken data files for DOS Quicken 1. It seemed to work. And then we had a bigger idea for what was it called? There's a piece of software that would do basically merge Quicken data into a Lotus 1, 2, 3.
Was that called Quicken Transfer Utility?
Quicken Transfer Utility. Thank you for reminding me. Yeah. So I think I got 17,500 shares of Intuit stock for that, which is probably I don't know, tens of millions of dollars today if I'd kept it. They couldn't afford to pay me any cash. And it used the same terminate and state resident technology I'd built for the calendar program. And it solved a need, which is Quicken was a simple, effective personal finance product, but it didn't have much reporting. And this allowed you to move data into a spreadsheet and kind of have more analytical capability. And so that was kind of fun, and they liked it. And I thought this is more fun than working on a hospital or an AC Nielsen client in Bain. And so during the kind of spring and summer of 1986, I started talking seriously to Tom and Scott about joining the company, and that kind of came together around, I guess, August of 1986, and I started in September of 1986. One question that was tricky at the time was, what should my role be? And obviously Scott was CEO, and Tom was VP engineering, and I had technical skills, and I think they wanted me to write code. We all knew that, but I'd been to Harvard Business School, so I said, I need some other title. So I said, I'll be your chief financial officer. And so in the early years, that'll be a very simple job, and then over time, probably the coding will go down, the CFO job. And I remember doing this with my hands. One goes up, and the other goes down. And we said, sounds good, and we inked the deal. And I mean, to an astonishing degree, that's what happened actually. So I mean, in my early years, I used probably 80 or 90% of my time coding, and then it drifted down, and by 1992, I would say I was more or less out of the coding the coding business. So it took 6 years instead of 3 years, but I actually did do that evolution of responsibilities. I think I was productive technical contributor to it for quite a few years, and then gradually a business contributor, and they dovetailed surprisingly well.
So you describe that as this kind of rational transition, and yet during the time the company was having challenges as a new startup, and there was some, how to get financing, how to.
In 1985, the company was definitely having challenges. So the original strategy for Quicken software. Do you want to see the orange Quicken box, or has Scott brought that for you already?
We haven't seen that.
And of course, Intuit today is the TurboTax and QuickBooks company, but until about 1992, it was the Quicken company. I mean, there's Intuit. I mean, that's what the company was for the first 6 years that I was there. So this software was sold, not online. There wasn't such a thing. Not in stores, not even by mail order. It was sold over the counter at Wells Fargo banks. So that was the first distribution model. Is electronic banking software, no connectivity, but that's what it was. And it was $99.95, and I think we sold it to banks for $55 or $60 or something. So that what Scott found in 1985 is that because he's such a good salesman, he could sell these refrigerators to Eskimos. He could sell 100 units of Quicken to a bank, but then they couldn't sell through. And so I think he saw the handwriting on the wall and realized that this is not a durable business model. And so as I arrived in 1986, the company had raised a total of approximately $250,000 up to that time. Some of it from Scott's dad, some of it from Terry Grosswith. I think there might have been one other investor. And you've heard Scott's story, how all the VCs said no to him in those days. So there weren't a lot of options for developing an expensive new product line or any kind of product line. We had to make this work. And as I think I mentioned, Borland kind of burst onto the scene in probably early '86 with Sidekick. And one of the innovations was terminating state resident software, although I beat them arguably by a month. And the other innovation was they sold direct. So most software at that time was sold through computer stores. They took out space advertisements and newspaper advertisements, and cut out coupons, send in your $49.95, and then they mail you the software. And that we could tell. I mean, we knew that was working, and we also saw that when they got success in what we then called the direct channel, it kind of helped them to build retail distribution. So I think when I arrived, Scott and Tom had already studied that carefully, and we were preparing, to do the same thing with Quicken. And so we did two radical things in my first month there. One is we removed copy protection. So in those days, you probably know all about copy protection. It was intended to prevent piracy, and it was a major annoyer for consumers because you couldn't duplicate your program disk, and floppy disks had limited life, and so it was just a pain. And one of the things Borland had done is ship without copy protection as well, so kind of trusting users rather than handcuffing them. Dan Filstra was the copy protection guy, by the way, I should say. Though Lotus 123 also used copy protection, so it wasn't just him. So we got rid of copy protection, and we lowered the price from $100 to $50, and we said we're gonna sell it direct, and we shelled out not our last $10,000, but one of our last $10,000 on a PC Magazine article with a space ad for Quicken, and financial hassles might have been the tagline, and it worked. We could make enough money on one ad to pay for the cost of the ad and more. And so we started doing that hand over fist. And
how did your user base? Do you remember kind of the curve that you were on after that change in your model?
At that time, Intuit's fiscal year ended September 30th. It's 85, 6. Let me just do the math here. So we did 6 in 87. And we did 2 in 87, 6 in 80. The year I got there, 1986, we did $750,000 of revenue. About 40% of that time was selling checks and envelopes that went with Quicken. So say we had just under $500,000 of software sales that we were selling at about $50 at the time. So there would have been about 10,000 units, I guess. And maybe half of those units had just gone to banks and were sitting there, but we'd sold 5,000 or 10,000 units of Quicken. The first full year I was there, 1987, our revenue increased to $2 million. Again, about 40% was supplies, 1.2 million of software. We'd reduced the price, and we were starting to pick up distribution. So the average selling price would have been a blend of $50 at retail and $25 at retail and 50 direct. So let's call it $35. So maybe 40 or 50,000 units. So we went from 5,000 or 10,000 units to 40 or 50,000 units during my first year there. So a very, very exciting time.
Talk about rocket ships.
What's that?
Talk about rocket ships.
Well, I mean, little rocket ship,
Well,
bottle rocket.
it was starting.
But obviously led to greater things. So again, I would say I was fortunate. The company had done a couple of pivots. Up until that time, and I was there at a pivot that worked. I would say we had an Apple II version of this product as well.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah.
You and Tom rewrote for the Apple II version. Is that right?
Well,
is
the Apple II. So I did relatively little on the Apple II version.
For the ProDOS platform.
Yeah, ProDOS. You got all our terminology. Sure enough. So one of the first things I did was work with Tom on the ProDOS upgrade, where Apple there hadn't really been an operating system really, or a very simple operating system, because you booted the computer on your program disk, and there was 20K of OS code, and then your code ran on it, and so it didn't really. And I'm not even sure what the file system was, but ProDOS was a little bit more of an operating system, and that was important because customers were starting to buy 5 megabyte hard disks, and then you had multiple programs you had to be able to invoke and so on. And so we had to take the code, which was written in Pascal, and port it from one development environment, which I don't know, to the ProDOS Pascal environment. And there were, what was it like porting? It was, they were, not radically different, but there were a lot of things, that had to be changed. And some of the trickiest stuff was we would do something called formatting a disk so that we could create a data disk from kind of raw media for a customer. And that was assembly language 6502 code that you had to call from Pascal, and that was tricky. So I would say we spent, a month or two flat out getting the ProDOS upgrade out for Apple, probably at the end of 86 or early 87. And that was the famous episode where Tom and I think went 2.5 days without sleeping, and just because I think we'd promised our customers, I don't remember what the date was, and we just weren't going to go home until we had it going. And the development environment was not speedy, so every turn took a long time. But we just gritted it out. And so I'd say that was the first coding marathon that I remember being involved in. The other
How did you survive through those days? Yeah,
the other development work we were doing was a product we called Tiger, which was really the prototype of bank connectivity. The concept was to take a floppy disk with bank statement information and merge it with the customer's Quicken data, and that's sort of what Quicken and QuickBooks and all the mobile apps today do. But of course, there was no internet. There was hardly anyone had a modem, so it was floppy disk based when it was conceived. So that was, and we had a bank partner who was interested in that. So I would say in the fall of '86 and early '87, what we were working on was the Apple II upgrade, Tiger, getting rid of copy protection, and then in 1987, Tom and I said, we got to do it. We got this product has been around for by then. 2 years, which was old in those days for computer software. We got to do a new one. I told him that I thought the C language was great, and so he was kind of a Pascal fan, but we agreed to write a new version of Quicken in C. And so in early '87, we set out to do DOS Quicken 2, which was a new generation of this product. And we shipped that in September of 1987 after a strenuous, probably 8-month development project. So, Tom and I did most of the work. Carl Reese and Eric Schenk were hired during the course of the year and did some of the work on that product. And we definitely had some marathon overnight sessions, particularly, August and September, as that was as we were getting ready to release that. And then
for maybe could you just tell a story, I think, for young programmers who are looking to you as a role model, and to realize that it didn't come without a lot of hard work. Could you just describe some of that? Could you just paint the picture a little bit of this marathon plus the intensity at the end to make your deadlines? Any stories or particular memories?
Yeah.
What was that like?
So, when we hired Eric and Carl, I think, they were both right out of college and, eager young programmers. And so, so the first day they showed up at the office, and, it got to be 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock, and they said, anybody going home? No. And then, 7 or 8 o'clock, Tom went out and got some subs or something, and nobody goes home, and they kind of look at their watch. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, anybody going home? Midnight? And nope. What have we got ourselves into? And so they were there at a very intense time. So I think there was probably a couple-week period where, every night we were there till like 2 a.m. in the morning, just, fixing bugs and coding and getting stuff done. And I think we had like a whiteboard with a list of issues, and we had, I think Tom and I shared it. Did we share an office or something? But it was all very compact. I think there was just one room where we were doing this on. But we Intuit, when I joined, had one office in the basement of 540 University Avenue, a building which still stands, right across from the Webster Cupper Garage. It had Suite 50, the basement suite, which was about 1,400 square feet. On the strength of our success with this product, we added another 500 square feet upstairs. I guess there were 2 offices. Tom and I had adjacent offices up there stairs, so that was kind of the product development area on the ground floor. And we just hung out there all the time. Boy, I'm trying to remember, how did we test the software? So part of it is Quicken has the virtue of being a product that we could use ourselves, so we used it ourselves. We had our favorite beta tester was a guy called David Nanyan, who was a very good programmer who wrote a text editor called Brief. Those were the days when a text editor was a piece of software you bought and paid for. And so I can remember getting phone calls from David Nanyan, and that was always going to be something insightful that he'd say about the product. So, but it was a matter of you mailed out floppy disks to beta testers, and then you waited for their phone calls. So not quite the same as what we do today.
In this process of delivering product or software and then waiting for it to come back, there were times I'd love to hear your take on the 1987 when there was a bug in the software.
The date bug. My date bug. That's my bug.
Date bug,
right,
get cache error, right?
Get cache was get_cache, CACHE was the error message that I wrote that was exposed to customers after Thanksgiving with DOS Quicken 2. So momentous event in the early history of Intuit. So we used in those days only a minority of users had a hard disk, and they would have 1 or 2 floppy drives. And Quicken needed to, if they only had 1 floppy drive, you needed to sort of alternate having the program, and then you'd be prompt to put your data disk in, and then maybe you had to read an overlay and put the program disk in, and you needed to know which disk was which. So Quicken wrote a date stamp or a timestamp really on the data disk. So when it read it, if it didn't see the right timestamp, it would know something was wrong. And I wrote the code that generated the timestamp, and I wrote it poorly in the sense that it was a signed number, and at a certain point that signed number exceeded 32 bits and overflowed to a negative number, and then we were doing a signed comparison to determine if the timestamp was later or earlier than what it should be. And so what happened was, so in the fall of 1987, we'd shipped a lot of Quicken 2s for us, tens of thousands probably, because we sold upgrades to our current users and they were happy to buy it. And I remember coming in maybe the Monday after Thanksgiving, sort of feeling great. We'd shipped the product, people were buying it, seemed to be working well. And then Leslie Co, who was our tech support department at the time, came upstairs and said, Eric and Tom, there's something going on. Customers are reporting this get cache error. I said, what? And they said, yeah, here's the scenario. And I tried it on my computer. I said, no, it seems to work fine. And then Tom tried it and said, oh, I get this error. And I said, oh, look, the date's wrong on my computer. So my clock was a day early or something. And I set it to the correct date. Sure enough, there it was. So basically the scenario was every customer who kept their data on a floppy disk, which is probably half of them, couldn't record a transaction without getting an error because of this wraparound problem. So it didn't take long to find the problem, but it was not like today where you would push an update, the App Store. So, we had to track these customers down. Either we'd sold to them directly and we had their names, or we hoped they'd send in their registration cards, handwritten registration cards if they were retail buyers. So we spent about a day making sure we really had a fix, and then we knew we had to get disks out as soon as possible to all our customers, and so that meant duplicating disks. We had a relationship with a disk duplicator, but they could only do so many per day, so we decided we'd duplicate disks ourselves in the office using the 2 floppy drives of our machine. And I remember we set up a batch file where you could run hit the space bar with your toe as you're switching drives, and so we're using every machine in the office, 10 or 12 of them, to duplicate disks so we could get this done more quickly. And then Carol Rasmussen printed out the mailing labels, and we wrote a letter and went to the copy shop and printed 10,000 copies of the letter and folded them up, and we spent all of Thursday at the conference room table, opening disk mailers, folding the letter, putting a disk in, sealing it, putting a stamp on, slapping a label on. Just manually doing all this work. Everybody in the company, there were probably 12 or 14 of us. That's all we did, for 36 hours. And then at about 4 o'clock on Friday, we realized we were done. We had these giant transparent garbage bags full of disk mailers, like 52 cents a postage on each one. And we had this figured out. There was a post office at San Francisco Airport, which was open late. So I grabbed these. Each garbage bag probably had 1,000 disk mailers in it, and I stuffed 10 into my Audi 5000 car, drove up to the San Francisco Airport, and then kind of unloaded them on the loading dock. And then that first most acute part of the crisis came to an end. We still had to replace the stock for our retailers. We had the blue dot so retailers would know that it was the updated version, and so I would say it was several weeks before we got through it, but we did get through it. And I think there were some kind of formative things that happened then. One is, obviously the company was hugely responsible to this customer problem, and you had to be. I think the other is that Scott really set a high tone at that time. So all he said was, "Are you sure the fix is right?" And I said, I've asked Tom to review it. We think the fix is right. And he could have said, "Don't do that again," or he could have said, "You idiot," or anything. But he didn't say any of those things. He said, "Are you sure the fix is right?" And so
interesting, defining moment.
Yeah, it's sort of a defining moment for the company. And I use that in my own company. I say, we have an experimentation culture, and that means you can make mistakes. That's what it means. But if you make a mistake without learning from it, that's bad. So I think we set that cultural expectation at Intuit at that time and through other incidents, but certainly that was part of it. And thank you, Scott and Tom, for standing by me in a difficult time. It could have brought the company down, and it didn't. And we went on to sell, hundreds of thousands of copies of the DOS Quicken 2 software between September of '89 and I think we phased it out in June or July of 1989. So it was a very successful product, but it definitely had teething problems. And we relived that with the DOS QuickBooks 1.0 in 1992. That was not my code there, but it can happen.
let's see, what should we do next? So you've faced this kind of defining moment. You're growing. The customers and the PR that came around that, you survived and went on, as you said, to move.
You know, we were small enough. I mean, we'd only ship like 10,000 customers, so we
10,
weren't.
10,000,
I mean,
right.
I think people had heard of us, but we weren't. We weren't really well known, I would say, until a year or two later. We were an early up and comer. 15-person company. We weren't that big. Retailers were forgiving. I'm sure Alan Gleischer at Softcat, was part of that. He later came to work at Intuit, but he was our champion in one of the important retailers early on. I guess we might not have been the only software company that had ever had a bug, so maybe that helped as well.
Yeah, certainly not the only one.
Yeah.
As you're thinking about, should we next turn to kind of the road to the IPO?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so Intuit kind of, grew and prospered. So I can let me get all the way up there. So Intuit grew and prospered on the basis of Quicken with the supply sales for quite a few years. I think I mentioned the year I joined, we did $750,000 revenue. We did $2 million in fiscal '87. We did $6 million in fiscal '88, and we did $18 million in fiscal '89. And
Steep ramp.
I used to tell people I have the easiest revenue forecasting job I ever heard of. I just triple what it was a year ago. That's our revenue. People were buying PCs at a rapid rate. We had a useful product that was better than the alternatives. They bought a lot of them, and we grew. The successor to DOS Quicken 2, DOS Quicken 3 was a very solid product that was widely used. So we went from one success to another. In the year after we reached 18 million, there's a little bit of plateauing, I'd say, in the uptake of PCs, and so we only grew from 18 to 33 million, less than doubling, and we thought, oh boy, are we dumb or something? What are we doing wrong? We only grew 85% this year. And then the next year we only grew about 40%. So I think we had started to realize there were limits to growth, but at the same time, we'd also understood that there was a very significant opportunity facing Intuit, which was to do a small business version of Quicken. Even back to the very, very earliest days in 1986 with this product, the registration card, let me see if I actually have one, had a checkbox for how do you use Quicken, and let's see if it actually says, do you use it for home or business? Where's my? Oh, I hope they didn't already. Somebody might have already mailed in the registration card. No, here it is.
Is it on the back?
I use Quicken for home use, business use, both. So early on, Scott was asking the right questions, or Tom, or whoever thought this up, and what we found out was that envelope was coming back with the business box checked surprisingly often. And the reason we came to understand was that there was PC software like Peachtree that did accounting for small businesses, but it was written by accountants in many cases, and it was hard to use. And Quicken was simpler, but it was easy to use, and so nobody had really kind of squared easy to use and does comprehensive business bookkeeping and tracking. And so by about 1989, I think, or 890, we realized there was an opportunity to pursue. We hired a guy named Rich Evers, I think he was a friend of Peter Wendell's, to add a payroll calculator to Quicken, and then that turned out to be a little bit of a damp squib, and kind of repotted that as the QuickBooks effort, which I think really kicked off in probably 1990. So starting from forking from the DOS Quicken code base, the DOS QuickBooks team began work on the first version of QuickBooks in 1990 and ultimately shipped in 1992. So I think that was obviously a hugely important development, and certainly in hindsight, and even at the time we realized it was important.
Did you realize the significance that it might
I think we
play?
realized that this could be big. We had unlimited ambitions for Quicken, but I think we realized that QuickBooks could be big as well. I think the QuickBooks name came from Sam Klepper, who was the earliest product manager. He turned down the name SmartBooks in favor of QuickBooks, in part to have a little bit more of a family ring to it. Sam deferred going to business school a year in order to be around for the QuickBooks launch. and that still wasn't enough. So he had to go to business school, and the product manager who actually was presided over the launch was a guy named Jay O'Connor, who was the son of Justice O'Connor, in fact. And by kind of a funny coincidence, my second year at Intuit, my wife did a Supreme Court clerkship for Justice O'Connor. So we slightly knew the family in two different ways. So Jay presided over the launch of QuickBooks 1.0, which in some senses was a huge success, but it was marred by some technical glitches where I would say the file system for QuickBooks, it borrowed from DOS Quicken, and it stressed it much more than I had designed it to accomplish. And I don't know whether I had a bad design or I had a bad adaptation, but basically there was a lot of problems with data files getting corrupt and not being able to open or not being able to be read. And so we went through 4 or 5 iterations of QuickBooks releases in the space of 6 months, and with kind of the apologetic letter to the customers. And we had at one point we had a team of 20 or 30 people in our customer care location who were kind of trying to use crude tools to recover data. And we had a very, very difficult launch. We'd actually thought about going public in May of 1992. We'd interviewed bankers, and then just at the time we were kind of starting to think about organizational meetings, we started getting reports from our care organization that all was not well with QuickBooks. So we said let's get this understood. And by the end of the summer, 6 releases later, and a release was this many floppy disks, in a thick disk mailer, we'd gotten ahead of the problem. But that was part of the that was part of what drove the timing. We could have been a 92 IPO instead of a 93. The other thing that was going on so a couple of important things were going on in our business, and you may have covered these with other people you've interviewed, but the most important thing that happened was the Windows operating system became widely used in about 1991, 1992, and we didn't have initially a good plan for building a Windows version of Quicken and later for QuickBooks. And we hired a contract firm to port DOS Quicken 4 to Windows in early 90, late 90, early 91, and it became rapidly apparent that they were going to have trouble getting a product out by the fall of 91, as we'd hoped. And then we'd also found through some insider, some friends of the company who worked at Microsoft, that Microsoft had decided to launch a personal finance product called Microsoft Money in the fall of 1991 on the Windows operating system. And we knew they were interested because a Microsoft product manager came and visited our company in 1990 and said, we would like to create a product called Microsoft Quicken. You just lend us the code base. So give us your mailing list and license the brand, and we'll pay you $7 a unit royalty, and you don't have to do any work. And so it was kind of a brassy move on their part, just saying to sign over the future of your company to be a modest royalty stream from Microsoft, because we had no other business to speak of at the time. We did have a Mac product, and Tom scornfully shooed them out of the office, and then later notoriously answered a question from a colleague or an employee. What are you going to do? He said, we will crush them. So which, was a huge amount of bravado in the fall of 1990. Mm-hmm. And, by January of 92, the bravado was looking, a little dangerous because our contractor was not making good progress. So I had, in keeping of the theory, of ramping down my development, theoretically kind of retired from doing program work after DOS Quicken 4 shipped in September of 1990, added investment tracking capability to Quicken. But I got very worried, as did a couple of other engineers. And so we just concluded we had to bring this back in-house, and I had to do it I had to lead this myself if we were going to ship more or less at the same time as Microsoft Money. So I spent a very intense 7 months, aided by my current CTO, Tim Villanueva, who he and I were, kind of the two leads on the project, building a Windows version of Quicken that we launched in October, a few weeks after Microsoft Money. And then, a month or two later, Walt Mossberg did a review in the Wall Street Journal and said, Quicken is better. We go, woof.
Right, that was such a risky time, right?
Right. And then our marketing and sales and marketing team did an awesome job, driving the upgraders to the stores, and the upgraders wanted Quicken on Microsoft Money, and so one way or another, we held Microsoft at bay. So the things that led up to the IPO were showing that we could compete with Microsoft. And Microsoft, by the way, had trashed, Lotus with Excel, WordPerfect with Word, Harvard Graphics with PowerPoint, all other operating systems. They killed OS2 in favor. So they were kind of a death machine, and so we survived our encounter, with Microsoft, and we had a growth opportunity with QuickBooks. And so by the fall of 1992. When we had a board meeting, I was on the board of Intuit from '86 until after just as we went public. John Doerr invited us up to his Kleiner Perkins office, on the 10th floor of some skyscraper in San Francisco, and looked at us all and said, "This is classic John Doerr. It's time to put the puck on the ice," which meant time to go public. And we kind of agreed.
Did the timing feel right to you?
The timing felt right. We were feeling good about QuickBooks. We knew we had a Windows version of QuickBooks under development. Microsoft was, at bay. I mean, they were a very capable competitor who made us a lot better, but they weren't seriously denting our market share. So that's how that came about. And we went public quickly in March of '93, and that all worked well.
There's always, not always, but there are often challenges that come when you're going public, decisions to be made. How do we allocate shares? What's the pricing going to be? Who are we going to work with? Do you want to talk about any of that aspect of those decisions?
Yeah. Let's see. We ended up going with Morgan Stanley. Frank Quattrone was our lead banker, and Robert.
In his oral history, in Frank's oral history, actually, he tells his side of the story of this.
And Jim Foy from Robertson Steven was our number 2 lead. Scott had innovative ideas like doing one of these kind of populist IPOs where you allow customers to buy shares, and maybe in the age of the internet it's easier to do that. It was just a little too hard for us to do, and we also there was another reason to get the puck on the ice, which is stuff was brewing in the tax category, and and our Chipsoft had already gone public, and so we needed to be on a level playing field in the tax category. We needed to be public. So I think if we'd had all the time in the world, we might have done something kind of populist and innovative, or like the Google reverse auction. But as it was, we focused on speed, and so speed and certainty, and that led us to very well established team. Frank Quattrone was backed by Mary Meeker as the analyst, and Bill Brady, and they knew how to do this. And we worked with Gordy Davidson and folks at Fenwick and West, and so it was all. I would say it was all very straightforward. Internal share allocation decisions. We had some, we had a little bit of pushing and tugging in 1990 when we did our venture financing, where we sold a third of the company. Actually, employees owned mainly Scott, owned the entire company up till 1990, and we sold a third of the company to TVI, Kleiner Perkins, and Sierra Ventures. The third of the company? No. They put in $12 million, so 5, and 2. I guess we sold a sixth of the company. And there were some adjustment of founder shares, that had to be done at that time. But that was all ancient history. So we had a clean cap table, and I think we initially priced our IPO at $12 to $14, and then there was strong demand, and after the roadshow, and so it went out at 20. And I think on the first day it traded to 33, which is great, and then I think it got as low as 24 or 25, and then I think it's been up since then, if I recall.
He says so modestly.
Yeah.
So that was a big day.
Yeah.
How did you celebrate?
How did we celebrate? I think, Morgan Stanley took us to a nice dinner in New York, and then we all flew home. One of the things I think Scott and Tom did, which they took pains to do, was to explain to our employees that going public is not the end of the game. It's just a a carriage stop on the journey. And we actually had an all-hands meeting with our employees probably in February, where we invited Roger McNamee to speak about, his perspective. And because as an investor, he knew that not just for the company and employees, but for investors as well, the IPO is just the first step of the journey. And so I think we did a good job of saying keep doing what you're doing. We have the same people, the same buildings, the same code base, the same customers, the same tech support calls as a public company that we had at a private company. And just keep doing what you're doing. And mostly it's the PR and the finance people are going to have to deal with this, and life should continue pretty much the same, though you'll have some liquidity for your stock options, which is good. So I think that was one right thing we did. The other right thing we did was we did an exercise in probably late 92 or early 93 called Vision, Mission, Operating Values, Achievements. And we defined a vision for the company. We wrote down the mission. We set 10 operating values, since trimmed down, I think, to 5 or 6. But we consciously said we have a company culture that we value, that we want to take a snapshot of, write down, and then make sure we preserve that, as knowing that there are extra pressures of being a public company. So I think we were thoughtful, and we took some reasonable steps, like writing down the values, getting outside speakers, and coaching our employees to keep doing what they're doing.
For the record, can you share that articulation that you had for those values? Do you remember any of them?
I can't. I don't remember them all off the top of my head.
That's
but
okay.
It was started with do right by customers, and and integrity. That's probably number one. And the right bracket was integrity without compromise, not even close to the line. And then many things in between that I can't call to mind. But they've morphed into, as I said, 5 or 6. At Intuit, and then my own company, we have basically versions of those 6 that we continue to use. I think Intuit has found it durably valuable, and companies that have been spun off from Intuit in various ways have inherited many flavors of those operating values. So I think you'll find them in lots of corners of Silicon Valley and beyond today.
That's an interesting impact that it's the culture part has endured as it's gone on to founders or leaders of other ones. So you're CFO at this point, and do you want to comment on anything else around the kind of financial health or post-IPO?
Post-IPO, what got interesting is there were 3 players in the personal finance tax market, and that had to kind of, and they kind of rearranged their dance partners. So at the time of the IPO, there was Chipsoft, who only did tax software, TurboTax. There was Intuit, which only did personal finance software, Quicken, and there was a smaller company called Mecca, which had the number 2 finance product and the number 2 tax product. Their finance product was a product called Managing Your Money, which has more or less gone away after a couple of years. Their tax product, they actually had, it was complicated. They had a license to a product called TaxCut. And they had the exclusive, and it seemed like perpetual distribution rights to that, but they didn't actually own the product. And they were the number 2, and a strong number 2, but maybe 30% market share versus 70% for TurboTax, or 30. There's a 10% player and 60 TurboTax, and they were for sale. I mean, they were a small public company with a, I don't know, $50 million market cap or something. And with a pure tax company here and a pure finance company here, the company that had one of each had the potential either to turn Chipsoft into a personal finance company if it bought Mecca, and they could build on Managing Your Money, or it had the potential to turn Intuit into a tax software company if we'd bought Mecca instead. And so it was a little bit of a horse race there, and the belief at that time was that there was a lot of marketing benefit to having both a finance and a tax product. And I think that was real. That people who cared enough to track their finances on a personal computer were, had above average propensity to prepare their taxes. So everybody saw that these things probably should kind of live within the same corporation, but there are these 2 pure plays and one hybrid out there, all public, kind of eyeing each other. And so Mecca tried to sell itself to both Chipsoft they tried to do a reverse auction where they could sell themselves. So they say, who will give us more money? Will you give us more money, Chipsoft, or will you give us more money, Intuit? And Chipsoft was about to buy them, and then the Department of Justice said, that would be a problem. You can't do that. We don't want to put those two tax products together. So that changed. So that was a big deal in the summer of 1993 when the Department of Justice prevented Chipsoft from buying Mecca. So that meant if you looked at the combinations that were possible, the other two were now possible. Either Intuit could acquire Mecca or it could acquire Chipsoft. So we went from being kind of on a level playing field with Chipsoft to being somewhat advantaged by the Department of Justice ruling. In the meantime, Tom and Gordy Davidson and I had negotiated an option to purchase TaxCut, the tax software provider to Mecca, which put everybody's head to spin. And ultimately, we weren't able to exercise the option because of our own antitrust reasons. But between that ruling and having the option to buy TaxCut, Legal Knowledge System was the name of the developer of it, we had a fairly strong position. So during the summer of '93, there was a negotiation whether we would buy Mecca or buy Chipsoft, and in fact, it ended up, and very successfully, obviously, that we merged with Chipsoft on about a 60-40 basis, 60% Intuit, 40% Chipsoft, and the Intuit name, was preserved. And then Mecca, sold the bank software to, I guess, a bank consortium, and TaxCut was purchased by H&R Block, and continues, I think it's probably the basis for the software they continue to sell today. Not with as much success as TurboTax, but it's a viable product. So with the acquisition of Chipsoft by Intuit in September of 1993, really a lot of the pieces of the company were in place. We'd successfully launched DOS QuickBooks after some teething trouble. We'd followed that with a Windows version of QuickBooks led by Craig Carlson and Dan Wilkes, which was very successful. I think that was probably in '93 it was after the IPO, probably late '93. Quicken was doing well against Microsoft, and then we allied with the leading tax software provider, and so that was a good time. The fall of 1993.
Changed the landscape.
Yeah.
I want to be mindful of your time. I'm
Yep.
seeing that we got started a little bit late, and
Yeah.
we haven't quite finished even the Intuit story. Do you have a few more minutes?
I do.
Or what's
yeah,
your
I
time
do,
like?
yeah.
How about you, Justin? Do you have a few minutes?
You're not out of film, huh?
You're not-
Film. Let's film.
Let me just check here. Great. So you've gone through this, and it's changing. Also, the leadership is changing too. Right?
Mhm.
You and Scott are left from the early days. You want to, right? And
So leadership changes. So
talk
up
about the
through
leadership changes there,
'93,
too.
it was kind of the founding management team. So Tom, Scott, and I had been joined by a guy named Tom Lefevre, who had worked earlier at Intuit, maybe in 1984-85 as COO. He ran our supplies business, which, as I mentioned, was 30 or 40% of revenue at that time, an important business. John Monson ran marketing. In late '91, Tom and Scott hired Steve Pelletier to lead engineering. And we had Marsha Ralston running customer care. Jim Heeger joined the company around that time. This is all before Chipsoft. So we built out the management team quite a bit. With the merger with Chipsoft, we sort of had two management teams and a little bit of a dance trying to figure out who would do what. I took the opportunity to not be CFO anymore. They had a CFO, Bill Lane, who did it for another year, and so I had and then I transitioned after a couple of iterations to running the Quicken business within Intuit, and I also ran international during that period. But more importantly, at the CEO level, I think Scott reached the conclusion, as particularly with the Chipsoft complexity layered on, that he was not the very best person to lead the company to its broadest possible level of greatness, and so he worked particularly with John Doerr, I think, on trying to identify the next CEO to whom he should pass the torch, and that turned out to be Bill Campbell, which was, of course, an excellent choice. And so Bill started with us, I think, in the summer of 1994, and his first job was to fuse together the tax business based in San Diego and the Quicken and QuickBooks businesses based in Mountain View, and then very quickly got dealt a wild card in the fall of '94, when Microsoft reached an agreement to acquire Intuit for $1.5 billion, which was a record amount for a software company at the time. And then 8 months later, that deal was never consummated because of an antitrust objection. So he had a tumultuous, Bill Campbell had a tumultuous first 12 months, I would say, leading the company. But he's passed away, but he was a superb, unusually talented, gifted leader, and he pulled it all together. We got to 94, 95. Microsoft decided not to buy, that they can't buy Intuit, and so that was a tough period, actually, because a little bit of disappointment. Some of our employees, were kind of psyched. Microsoft, being bought by Microsoft is like being bought by Google in 1995. They're on the top of the world. They're just on the point of shipping Windows 95. They were everything in personal computer software at the time. So it was kind of a big disappointment. But Intuit recovered quite quickly. So it was a challenging time for some of our businesses because the web was happening. Financial institutions were able to communicate with their customers digitally for the first time, which undermined the value proposition of some of our products. There were just starting to be productivity apps built on the web that was mostly content at the time. Lots of startup activity. I mean, the late 90s were a time when, notoriously, you could raise money on just a business plan if it had a .com in the title of the business plan, and Intuit employees were being kind of pirated, or taken away or leaving to start their own companies, and many Intuit alums did very distinguished things during that era. But somehow Intuit kind of got its act together, even though it was a desktop software company in the age of the web and the internet, and gradually started the reinvention process, which is still happening today, and went on to be very successful. Bill Campbell retired in 2000. Steve Bennett came in, and I retired in 2000. So I had a 10-year first angel, then venture investing career from 2000 to 2010. I was on the board of a company called PayCycle that Intuit acquired in 2009, which was kind of the catalyst for me meeting Brad Smith, and I liked him, and I guess he liked me, and we kind of agreed that it would make sense for me to come back to Intuit in a role called Strategic Payments Initiatives, where I had a lot of energy about various payments ideas. I ran kind of a skunk works for 2 years, then it merged with the larger payroll payments business at Intuit, which I ran for another couple of years, and then in 2015, as part of a strategy review, Intuit had decided that 3 businesses it owned didn't fit the future vision. Those were Demandforce, an acquisition in the small business group that didn't work out that well, QuickBase, an online database that had been built from scratch, actually a tiny acquisition in 2000, to a successful SaaS business, but selling to enterprise, didn't fit with Intuit, and Quicken, which of course was the founding product of the company, but no longer was anything like a growth driver, and somewhat overshadowed by the Mint personal finance app. But so all 3 didn't fit. I think Intuit felt sort of a particular sense of obligation to the Quicken customer base who helped get the company started, and wanted to make sure that when it was sold, it would continue to be a well operated, viable product business company. And so I heard about this, raised my hand, and a little bit complicated, but I ended up being the person who was sort of running the Quicken business within Intuit, representing it to the potential buyers, and then after the buyer stepped in this case HIG Capital, running it as CEO for the private equity partner. And I give credit to Intuit in that when they evaluated buyers, certainly they looked at financial return, but where it was a close call, I think they had the so-called good hands test, where they wanted Quicken to land in good hands for the employees, particularly though for the customers and the brand. And they made an excellent choice with HIG, who's been a wonderful investor. And as a standalone company, Quicken Inc., we relocated half a mile north to the corner of Marsh Road and Haven Avenue, and we built a company with about 130 employees that are totally focused on bringing this franchise back to life. And at Intuit, Quicken had just been flat in revenue for a long period of time, and it had been parts of various larger businesses. So I wouldn't say that it was neglected, but it was getting a little dog-eared, would be maybe a polite way of saying it. It had been kind of passed around like an old book, and there hadn't been a lot of really close focus. It had been coupled with the Mint product, which had a lot of visibility, and so it had always been kind of a stepchild, dog-eared secondhand book. So what we brought to Quicken as a standalone company was focus, and so that is it's taken a while. We're now 3.5 years in as a private company, but we inherited net promoter scores of around 0 for Windows and deeply negative for Mac, which is on a new code base and hadn't gotten far. And we're now kind of in the 20s on both those products, which is not where we aspire to be, but I think it's where a lot of mainstream products are, and we're on a good trajectory. We doubled the spending on customer care, so that now we do a great job for customers, and we measure something called transactional net promoter score. And at Intuit, we were in the 40s, and the Intuit standard was 65. Right now, we're flirting with 80. So we've really made a lot of progress there. We changed the business model from licensed software to a subscription-based software product about 1.5 years ago, and that has been a very successful transition and made the business easier to run. And then the last thing we did is we built there'd been a mobile companion, basically a version of Mint at Intuit, which was kind of an afterthought. It had a 2.4 rating in the Apple App Store. So we rewrote that. We're now at 4.6 stars in the App Store, and then we also built a web companion. So now Quicken is a cloud synchronized product where you have a really good mobile product, a really good web product, and all three of them share the same cloud source of data. So and then we have some new initiatives in web and mobile extensions. So it's just been very straightforward. I mean, and to some degree, the Quicken software looks like Quicken software, but we've changed a lot internally. One big challenge for us was, as part of the Intuit family, customers signed in using Intuit One Identity, which is very capable, well thought out, highly secure service operated by the CTO group at Intuit. We had to build our own, so we built that from scratch over 9 months, and we had to find new partners and we have a durable partnership with Intuit on bank connectivity, which is working very well. We work with Olivier Helleboyd's team on OFX and other bank connectivity. So, in short, it's been it's taken a while to it's taken a while to get this far, but we're pleased with the progress we've made, and I think customers by and large would say, yeah, as a separate company, Quicken has gotten more attention and has improved during the time that it's been standalone, which is not too surprising. And then I should also say, our private equity partner HIG has been very supportive of investing in the product and care and the team so that we can have a successful company.
So if my math is right, you've been involved with Quicken for how?
Well, the first
3 decades, right?
34 years, I would say. I mean, the first,
more than 3
the
decades.
transfer utility I started working on in 85, and so here it is, 34 years. There was 10 years in the middle, or really 15 years in the middle, and I was kind of distant from it. And I used to I would tell my mom, I'm not your tech support agent for Quicken. Unfortunately, I had to stop saying that again after a while. But so I'd say a span of 34 years with kind of a 15-year cutout in the middle, but it's been a long involvement. And one thing that is fun for me is I had a wonderful, ride at Intuit. I mean, it was a great company. I enjoyed every part of it. I would say the part I enjoyed most was when we had 100 to 200 people, and that's about the size our company is now. So it's a very enjoyable size, and I think we have a good environment as well as a good business.
I'd like to just ask a couple questions and pull the lens back and say you've driven parts of the software industry now over literally decades here in the Valley. What perspective can you have about how the software business is as an industry is changing here? How it's done, what the impact and implications would be, how it's tied with the business model. I mean, you've lived through those changes and needed to reinvent it fundamentally.
Yeah. I guess one theme is, small venture-backed companies are huge, drivers of innovation and success, and Intuit was one, and so there's something magic about what Silicon Valley, brings together that enables kind of capital and entrepreneurs and talent, to come together. So there's when I was at business school, there was a thought that, Route 128 in Boston was going to be a tech ecosystem, that was, was going to rival or even surpass Silicon Valley, and that just didn't happen. So there's some nexus here, as you well know, which works remarkably well. So I'd say that's one point. But the counterpoint to that is, to a surprising degree, there have been. And you might have said, like in 1999, the giant company, is the dinosaur, and the whole world belongs to fast-moving startups, and we sort of felt that at Intuit. But there's been a reinvention process or an invention process by large tech companies that's remarkable. You look at the success of Amazon, in every category, in Google, in category after category, Intuit, growing and accelerating growth at scale. Apple, Facebook, and so there's sort of a new formula for running a large company, which is much better than the formula IBM had when I was there in White Plains in 1980 and 1981. So I think it's sort of taking some of the practices and behaviors of startups and adopting them at scale in large companies that seems to work.
When you arrived in the fall and talked about what the Valley looked like to today, again, the Valley as an ecosystem has also changed.
Yeah.
People come to the museum and always ask, what's the secret sauce? The DNA of the Valley. How would you answer that question?
I don't think you probably heard these exact same answers, so but I'll say them anyway. So first, it's the combination of capital being available, great student bodies from all the local universities and colleges, the entrepreneurs arriving from every part of the world and every part of the U.S. To do their thing, highly experienced kind of legal and accounting services that can make a company work. That somehow those are the ingredients. That's not the whole story, but those ingredients are there. And why is it that this works so much better than everywhere else? I don't know, but the ingredients are clearly there. Maybe the Bay Area is blessed with leaving aside the terrible traffic, a wonderful environment, a great place to live. So it's a lot easier to attract the best talent from around the globe here than if you were trying to move them to the North Pole.
As you look ahead, you're actively building Quicken now. What do you see as sort of opportunities and challenges for the Valley as a whole? In any area, it could be technology, economy, society, whatever you'd like to comment.
Well, the Silicon Valley is a victim of its own success, and I think we were both took us twice as long as we expected just to turn left onto Shoreline Boulevard from 101, just because so many people are productively employed right here. So there's some element of just limits to growth, and how much every day the newspaper is talking about housing cost and plans to try to offset that. So that's clearly an obstacle. It's just the fact that it's so difficult for many employees to literally to get to work, and then the cost of talent is high. I think I'm aware of a couple of companies that have sort of moved wholesale out of the Bay Area to, say, Denver, because the cost of hiring talented engineers and business people is probably 50% higher here than in other parts of the country. So, that's kind of self-equalizing, right? I mean, I don't think that means that Silicon Valley is will fall back, but it's a limit to the growth rate that there's congestion and expense operating a business here, and so maybe Silicon Valley will be on this trajectory, and other tech hubs will be on faster trajectories in the future.
As we close, I'd like to ask you just to reflect personally as both a programmer, a technologist, as well as an executive and leader of our company, and say, if you had a next generation innovator, aspiring innovator, or entrepreneur, what kind of advice could you offer? Lessons learned, hard-won advice?
Well, number one lesson is, make sure you're lucky. So, I mean, I was lucky in so many ways. As I said, by coincidence, I got married. My wife moved to Stanford, and we arrived, in Silicon Valley, in the fall of 1983, as the PC revolution was sort of unfolding, and the tech business was really starting to accelerate. So, really helped to be at the right place in the right time. I got introduced to fabulous entrepreneurs, Scott and Tom, at a time when they needed somebody like me, and we were able to find a way to work together productively. And then, Intuit had, some lucky breaks along the way. Obviously, there's a lot of, hard work and virtue and skill, but also some lucky breaks that got it to where it is. So it's hard advice to give somebody, but, not everyone is going to have as good luck as I was fortunate to have. But leaving that factor aside, for me, the formula of kind of combining a business background and a technical background has been good. And so, one thing it lets you do is you're not going to get BS'd by technical people. You kind of understand what's going on, and that's super helpful. And I say the other thing that it does for me is the fact that I'm sort of deep in the technology of the product even today. It just makes it more fun. For a mind like mine, it's interesting. And so when what you're doing is fun, I think you bring more energy and more time and more intensity. And that's been the case for me, and actually very much at this Quicken business. So be lucky, at least in my case, combine business and technical skills. And if you're fortunate enough to find something which is fun for you, that'll make you, I think, more effective and successful.
I'm just going to close with one thing. You've had expressed today so much of a passion and used the word fun about the work of you being hands-on and deep into the code and thinking about the problems and the possibilities. Can you just sum that up? Because that's, as a computer history museum, we need to hear you talk about that.
So the great thing about working at Intuit and also at Quicken now and building Quicken software is that millions of people use your product. And when Tom and I shipped DOS Quicken 2, that was a proud moment, not just because we completed a technical challenge, but we created a product that huge numbers of people would use, and they liked it. And so working at Intuit and working at Quicken, you feel like you're creating something that makes other people's lives work better, more smoothly, and you're sort of contributing to the world working a little bit more smoothly. And so the combination of the fun of kind of being in the weeds of technology and then having some positive overall benefit to the world from your work is pretty compelling.
That's a perfect way to end. Thank you so much, Eric.
Okay.
It's been a privilege to have you here.